Emotions Matter, brought to you by emaw.com. That's EMAWW.com. Your solution for emotional intelligence. Welcome to the Emotions Matter podcast. We're fortunate to have a fascinating guest whose expertise focuses in the area of crime and analysis. Scott Bonn, Ph.D., is a professor of criminology at Drew University, media commentator, public speaker, and author of the book Why We Love Serial Killers: The Curious Appeal of the World's Savage Murderers. He's an expert on the behavior and the motivations of criminals. He offers insights into various types of crime, including white-collar, state crime, bullying, domestic violence, sexual assault, and serial homicide via his Psychology Today blog, Wicked Deeds. His expert commentary frequently appears on CNN, Fox News, HLN, CBS, and the Huffington Post. Welcome, Professor Bonn. It's great to have you with us.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here, and please call me Scott.
All right, terrific. Well, I'll tell you what, let's start with a question that's probably most recognizable with your name. Why do we love serial killers? And kind of what is it that drives our fascination with the macabre?
Well, that's a great question to start with, John, and it's the premise of my book, Why We Love Serial Killers. It's what spurred me to write it. And what I found out through my research and talking to many, many people is that the answer is multifaceted, as are often many interesting questions. And first and foremost, there is the idea that these individuals, serial killers, are doing incredibly extreme, terrible things that the average person just can't comprehend. And as such, they are larger than life in a way. I mean, they represent a force of darkness and evil that is just beyond the normal human comprehension. Mm-hmm. And I believe, and I have my research would support this, that there is this fascination generally among people with things that are larger than life and dangerous and very scary. You know, we have a fascination with storms, with hurricanes and tropical storms. We have a fascination with earthquakes, natural disasters, and tsunamis. We have a fascination with living things that are very dangerous, like sharks. We even celebrate a Shark Week in popular culture. So I draw the analogy that serial killers are sort of the human equivalent of a great white shark. They are rare, they're exotic, and they're extremely deadly. And they exist, but they are not nearly as prevalent as we would suspect based upon the popularity of them in the media and the popular culture. They're actually extremely rare. Less than 1% of all homicides in the United States are perpetrated by serial killers. So just like great white sharks, they are rare, exotic, and deadly. And that is one of the I think most powerful things that I learned through my research. There's another aspect of it as well, and it's the puzzle. It's the whodunit puzzle. You know, we love crime stories. We love dramatic TV series, fiction, as well as true crime. And many of us are armchair detectives, and we love to try to figure out who done it. And when it comes to serial killers, it's the same thing. Many of the most infamous serial killers, or at least if not many, some remain mysteries to this very day, like Jack the Ripper, for example, and the Zodiac Killer. We don't know who those individuals were. So these are like whodunit stories that mysteries that stand the test of time, and that's an aspect of it as well. It also allows us, I think, to explore the dark side of the human condition. in each and every one of us is that idea that perhaps under extreme circumstances, maybe I could do something terrible. Boy, I had a bad day at the office. I could just kill my boss. I can't stand that guy. Do we really do it? No, we don't do it. But for a moment, we have that compulsion and that rage. Well, many of us, and myself included, are intrigued by the idea. What might I do under extreme circumstances? And serial killers are individuals who actually go out and do it. They do the most horrible things known to mankind. I mean, you look at an individual like Jeffrey Dahmer. He would kidnap individuals. He would have sex with them. He would murder them, and then he would actually dismember them and even eat them. Well, after that, what is there left? I mean, those are about the most horrible things that one human being could do to another. So it's almost like a train wreck that we're compelled to watch. It's like rubbernecking on the road. You see an accident and you're just compelled to look at it. So those are some of my takeaway observations from my research.
Well, I love the analogy of the great white shark. That's terrific. The whole dynamic of this is very fascinating. So from a perspective of your readers, what do you find really is the human emotion that drives a need for a topic like serial killing, or is possibly fulfilled by the topic? What emotion do you think drives that need to look at this stuff and be so fascinated by it?
Well, that's another great question, John. And serial killers are it's a horror show. I mean, really, it's a horror show. And when we're children, we love monster movies. I don't know about you, but I mean, I love going to the Dracula vampire movies and Frankenstein and all of those scary characters. And so in many ways, I think serial killers are for adults what those monster movies are for children. I mean, it's an adrenaline jolt. We love fun houses. We love haunted houses. We love scary movies. We get an adrenaline rush. Mm-hmm. So there's to a certain extent it's that the fear that we love. It's that adrenaline rush that gets the blood flowing. But at the same time, we don't want to really get hurt. You don't want Jeffrey Dahmer coming to your front door or Ted Bundy or something like that. Right. But we love the movies and we love the stories and we love the books and all of the pop culture references to these individuals. It's like we want to get close to the fire, but we don't want to get burned. And that's what the movies and the books and so forth and TV shows allow us to do. They allow us to get close to these individuals and explore them without getting burned. So I would say that fear and the adrenaline rush that goes with fear is a big part of it. And then the juxtaposition of that is the safety. Ultimately, we want to feel safe. So when these individuals are caught, when they're actually apprehended, and the loop is completed, we feel, then we feel safe, and we can study them behind bars and try to understand and get into their pathological behavior.
Very interesting about the human psyche and the need to have fear or the want of fear. Mm-hmm. And the adrenaline rush you said we get from having fear.
Absolutely. I mean, think of the child who will at an amusement park ride a roller coaster over and over until they get physically sick. I mean, it's like an addiction to the adrenaline, and I think it's the same thing, with the compulsion with true crime. True crime genre of television and books is one of the hottest categories right now. I mean, look at the Discovery ID, Investigation Discovery. It's a whole network dedicated to true crime. You have Oxygen that is converting over to a true crime format. And then you've had all of these limited series on HBO and Showtime that are dedicated to true crime. And like The Jinx on HBO, that was a terrific series about Robert Durst. Mm-hmm. And people just love this stuff. They eat it up. They want to understand the pathological mind. They want to understand how and why people can do these things, and also get that adrenaline rush at the same time.
So, as an expert on the behavior, what insights can you share regarding any common traits that are sort of shared among the group of these individuals? Maybe more specifically, what kind of defines a psychopath?
Okay. Well, first and foremost, not all serial killers are psychopaths. Probably about a third of them are, maybe 40%, something like that. But they're not all psychopaths. That's important distinction to make. And let's start by defining what a psychopath is. And I think and while I do that, I'm going to contrast it with a sociopath, because oftentimes there's a confusion between those two terms, and people, including even supposed experts, will use the two terms interchangeably, and they're actually two very different things. A psychopath and a sociopath, either one is considered antisocial personality disorder. They are not mental illness as defined by the American Psychological Association. They are antisocial personality disorders, and as such, there's no cure for them. There's no recognized treatment or drug that can eliminate the traits of a psychopath or a sociopath. Now, what's the distinction between the two? A psychopath is an individual who is essentially unplugged emotionally. They do not have the ability to feel or experience real emotion. They can mimic it. They oftentimes, psychopaths many times are very adept at mimicking emotional behavior and affect and empathy, but they don't actually feel it. They're flatlined when it comes to emotion. They're able to feel euphoria. They're able to feel rage in some circumstances, but they don't feel empathy. They don't feel sorrow. They don't feel fear in a normal way. And as such, they're the perfect killing machine, because they don't have the range of emotions and feelings that would inhibit most of us, 99% of us, from doing the things that they do. They simply just don't have that emotional connection. Now, a sociopath, on the other hand, is an individual who, imagine if there's an empathy cord plugged in the wall that allows you to experience empathy with others. For a sociopath, it's a faulty plug. Sometimes they can connect with other individuals, and sometimes they do not. With the majority of people, in the majority of situations, they do not feel empathy or an emotional connection. But in some rare situations, they do. They may have a brother or another loved one that they feel close to, and they can feel empathy with that individual. But under most circumstances, not. Now, consequently, because their ability to empathize and feel emotion sort of comes and goes, a sociopath is easier to see in your midst. They're easier to see coming than a psychopath, because psychopaths are just stone cold and they're unemotional. Sociopaths tend to be more volatile. They tend to have streaks of anger, bouts of rage, and they're just much more easy to identify when they're in your midst. So. And also psychopaths are more rare. It's believed that there's maybe 1 million psychopaths in the United States out of 300 million people, and perhaps 8 or 9 million sociopaths. So sociopaths are actually more prevalent. You're much more likely to come in contact with a sociopath. Now, just because one is a sociopath or a psychopath does not mean that you are prone to violence. Or murder. In fact, some psychopaths just are extremely successful in certain endeavors, in business or politics, where it is advantageous for one to simply not care about the feelings of others, and you're just very goal-oriented and rather cold-blooded, those characteristics in certain endeavors, particularly business and politics, can make one very successful. So we should not confuse being a psychopath or a sociopath necessarily with violence per se. But when they are violent, then those personality characteristics are very conducive to being a successful killer or criminal.
So the common trait there is this lack of empathy, or lack of, how did you describe it? You described it, the lack of...
A lack of the ability to connect with another human being.
Gotcha.
And which includes empathy. And so, for example, to a psychopathic serial killer like Dennis Rader, I interviewed Dennis Rader, who called himself Bind, Torture, Kill (BTK) for my book. And what he told me is that to him, human beings were simply interesting projects. He referred to killing as a project, almost like a hobby.
Wow.
And so he, by describing it in that way, he's completely detaching himself from it emotionally. You know, it's as if he's putting together a model airplane, and that's the way he would explain killing to you. It was simply just an interesting thing for him to do. And now, once again, I should emphasize that the psychopathic or sociopathic characteristic is common among serial killers, but it's certainly not prevalent, or it's not present in all serial killers. There are some serial killers who actually do feel remorse for their crimes and feel are torn apart emotionally by it. The ones that have received the most notoriety and are so well fixed in our popular culture, like Ted Bundy and BTK and Jack the Ripper. I would throw him in there, even though he was never identified. I would say that these individuals are true psychopaths, individuals who just have no remorse at all for their crimes.
So let me ask you something. Have you found any common triggers that start serial violent offenders' activity? Maybe the emotions that drive the behavior different for murder as opposed to someone performing serial domestic violence?
That's also a very interesting question. There has been a pattern that's been identified among a number of fledgling serial killers early in their adolescence, and this was true of Jeffrey Dahmer. It was true of Dennis Rader, BTK, David Berkowitz, and others. And here's what where I'm leading. These individuals who have subsequently, after their capture, been identified as psychopaths, described a pattern that happened early in their adolescence. They would become fixated with animals and with tormenting and torturing and killing animals, strangling cats, things like that, or in some cases, a fixation on the carcasses of animals. Jeffrey Dahmer would find dead animals in the woods behind his house and enjoy putting his hands inside the body cavities of these dead animals. And what would happen is he would become sexually aroused. So it's very important that this interest in torture, this interest in killing and harming animals happens right around the age of adolescence and a sexual awareness. And what seems to happen in these individuals who have that psychopathic personality and who are also interested in dead things, somehow sex and violence become intertwined and become confused to this 13-year-old fledgling serial killer. They become sexually aroused by dead things and by harming others. Now, this tends to go on for a period of years. It may be 10 years that this develops inside of them, this obsession and this compulsion. And then finally, in their early to mid 20s, they are compelled to actually act it out and to kill a living person. And sex, in many cases, about 50% of the cases, sex is and the desire for hedonism and sexual gratification is very much intermingled with the need to kill.
So do you find that it's different for someone who's going to be murdering versus, say, just a serial domestic violence activity? I'm assuming the triggers are different for those.
Oh, yeah,
are they the same?
Absolutely. Serial killers, the one characteristic that all serial killers have in common is fantasy, which is very unique to them. Domestic violence perpetrators, bank robbers, do not fantasize about their crimes. They may have a compulsion to do it. A serial rapist, for example, is driven by the need for power and control, but they don't necessarily fantasize. Serial killers fantasize about their killings, about exactly what they're going to do for days, weeks, and sometimes months leading up to the crime. Fantasy is the one common trait among all serial killers. Now, what drives that fantasy is different. You have a serial killer like Dennis Rader, BTK. His fantasy was all about power and domination. Mm-hmm. He wanted to kidnap the individual. He wanted to tie them up, torture them, and ultimately kill them. For others, like Jeffrey Dahmer, it was very much about sex. But I really want to emphasize that when it comes to serial killers, that common thread is always a fantasy. There's a fantasy need that is being served by their killing.
So that gives me sort of an interesting thought about the emotion of desire. Is that what I'm hearing is maybe there's a different level of intensity about something between, say, if you're going to do murder versus just a serial sex offender?
Yeah, absolutely. You could frame it as desire in the case of a serial killer, but I've used the analogy of almost it's like an addiction. Mm-hmm. It's almost like when you hear Dennis Rader or David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, who I also interviewed for my book, when you hear them describe the build-up to their murders, it's almost describing like a drug addict the need for another fix, that they have to have it. It's simply nothing is going to stand in their way from the next murder because they have to have it. Well, that sounds very much, as I said, like addiction. Now, in the case of Jeffrey Dahmer, and I like to use him as an example, he is what is referred to as a hedonistic lust killer, and meaning that he actually believed that he loved these men, that he was killing and eating. He actually believed that he loved them. So there was true sexual and in his mind romantic desire for these individuals. Mm-hmm. But I think it would be a bit of a stretch to say that all serial killers are driven by desire. It's almost more of a compulsion. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned sexual sex offenders like rapists. Mm-hmm. It's really a myth, and it's a dangerous myth that they are driven by sexual desire. They're not. They're driven by domination. They're driven by the need for domination, power, and control. And they exercise that control. They manifest that control and domination through a sexual act. But it's actually the sexual gratification is not the goal. It is domination, power, and control.
So you've written extensively on homicide facts. You've got a whole section of homicide facts on your website. Give our listeners your perspective on things like race and age and gender for both the serial offender and the victims.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you asked me that question. There's a lot of mythology out there. If you watch TV news or TV mysteries, fictional mysteries, oftentimes the victim of a murder investigation is an attractive young white female. And why? Because it makes for interesting television. You know, the attractive young, white woman who's being murdered. But the reality is that an attractive young white woman, is the least likely murder victim. In fact, the most likely murder victim in the United States is a young black man. And at the same time, the most likely perpetrator is a young black man. Unfortunately, what we have in the United States is a situation where young blacks are killing other young blacks, and oftentimes this occurs in urban areas and over drug trades, over drug trafficking. And unfortunately, we have a heroin epidemic that has emerged again in recent years, and there's been a spike in murder in the last couple of years that has been linked directly to the heroin trade. So again, we have quite a few young black men killing other young black men. But that's not the picture that you would get if you watch news stories, because or in particular televised trials. Think about the really high profile televised trials in recent years. And you can start with OJ. Almost always, the victim is an attractive young white woman, whether it was Nicole Brown Simpson. You may remember Scott Peterson killed his wife, Lacey Peterson.
Right.
In almost all of these cases, the victim is this attractive young white woman. And recently, we've sort of flipped that around, and the perpetrator is an attractive young white woman, or the alleged perpetrator. And you've got Casey Anthony, you had Jodi Arias, you had Amanda Knox, Foxy Knoxy. So you've got these attractive young white women who are the alleged perpetrators. Once again, the least likely perpetrator of murder is a young white woman. So oftentimes the media don't portray the reality of homicide.
You must have one favorite case of a serial killer. Share that with us and tell us something more about the emotional background of that case.
Okay. I don't know if I would say it's my favorite. It's kind of I mean, I understand your question. It's a little bit funny to say, your favorite serial killer, but I think certainly one of the most interesting and shocking stories was that of Ed Kemper, who was known as the co-ed killer. Have you heard of him?
I haven't.
You haven't? Okay.
No.
He was out in California, and Ed Kemper is a man who stands 6'9" and nearly 300 pounds. He's really a giant. He also has a genius level IQ. His IQ has been measured at over 130. Actually, I think it's been measured as high as 160. And he was raised by a very abusive alcoholic mother who just tormented him. She would burn him with cigarettes. She would lock him in the root cellar with rats. I mean, she was really evil mom. And guess what? Ed grew up to despise his mother, and he began to act out in his early teens. And he was sent away. His mother sent him away to live with his grandparents. Well, Ed didn't particularly like his grandmother either. So one day he picked up a shotgun. I think he was 15, and decided it would be interesting to kill his grandmother, and he'd get her off his back. So he shot his grandmother, And then he waited for his grandfather to come home, and he decided, well, Grandpa's probably not going to like the fact that I killed Grandma, so I better kill him too. So he shot Grandpa, and then he was arrested. But he was a minor. He was 15. He was sent to in a psychiatric hospital, where he remained until he was in his late teens. And remember, Ed has a genius level IQ. Mm-hmm. He broke into the psychiatrist's office at this mental hospital, and he memorized all the psychiatric evaluations, all the tests. So he was able to give the right answers. And they thought by the age of 19 that he had been cured. So he was let go. Guess what? He ends up back living with his mother again, his hatred toward her continued, and he fantasized. Again, all serial killers have fantasy. He fantasized about killing his mother, but he wasn't able to work himself up to that. He wasn't ready to do it yet. So he began a killing spree of killing young co-eds from a local university out in California. Began killing young women, young college students. He killed 6 or 7 of them. I forget the exact number. It was 6 or 7. And then finally, he was able to prepare himself to kill his mother. And he did. One night, he beat her to death with a claw hammer. And he also killed her best friend, who happened to be there. And this is where the story really gets even more crazy. He decides at this point to turn himself in. He's done. He's finished. His ultimate fantasy was lived out. He killed his mother, so he turns himself in. But the police refused to believe that he had done this because he had befriended them in San Francisco. He had been following his own case and hanging out in the bars and drinking with the cops, the very cops who had been pursuing him, and he just became their buddy, Big Ed, and they refused to believe that Big Ed was the one responsible for all of this carnage. And he said, no, he said, come on over to the house. My mother's head is on the dresser. You'll find it. And sure enough, they did, and they arrested him. And so sometime later, and I'm getting to the end of the story now. Sometime later, he was in prison, or in a psychiatric hospital, and he was interviewed by, of all people, Cosmopolitan magazine went in to interview him, and they said, Ed, now that you're done with all this, is this anger toward women over? Are you finished? And he said, well, yeah. He said, I actually think that I could have a normal relationship with a woman, but when I come to think of it, I'd always wonder what her head looks like on a stick.
Oh, my God. Amazing.
That's the story of Ed Kemper.
What a story. So I tell you what, we actually have a question from one of our listeners. Her name is Maggie. She's from Chicago. She kind of has, well, I'm going to consider sort of a troubling question, but maybe not. One of her male friends has recently started down a path of increased drug use and is becoming, well, she calls it increasingly antisocial. He doesn't seem to exhibit any real emotions or empathy toward the people around him. She's wondering how to deal with him and whether she should be worried about if he could become violent, maybe.
Well, immediately upon hearing that question, the red flag goes up, and I say dangers. My immediate advice to her would be stay away from this individual, especially if he's abusing drugs and or alcohol, because he's could become very volatile. You don't know what he might be capable of, and so I would draw a boundary and simply stay away from that individual. I don't know, obviously, from the limited information, to what extent how involved this person is in her life. I mean, do they frequently interact? She might want to leave some literature around about substance abuse, that he can find. I certainly wouldn't confront him directly about it, because he might become, angry or confrontational. Mm-hmm. But I would say, to the best of her ability, just keep away from this person, because it could be a problem.
Gotcha. So nothing that, other than give him some literature, etc., but as you say, don't try to confront him directly.
No, the worst thing that you can do with somebody who may be prone to violence, and especially if they're abusing alcohol or drugs, is to confront them directly, because you're very likely to incite them and trigger their anger.
So that's another interesting point. Is there something that you found that what is the trigger? Is it specific words or actions, or what is the trigger? I mean, I'm assuming there's different triggers for, serial killers versus serial rapists versus just domestic violence abusers, etc. But is there a common thread of triggers in these guys?
The emotion most associated with violence is anger. Mm-hmm. And so whatever triggers that anger, mm-hmm. And that's why serial killers again are a really an exception to the rule, because so many of them are psychopaths. They're not driven by anger. They're driven by fantasy. They're driven by their own internal needs and desires and wants and compulsions that the rest of us can't understand. But most murders, most homicides in the United States are crimes of passion. Mm-hmm. You are way, way, way more likely to be in a bar, have some drinks, get into an argument with somebody over the Red Sox versus the Yankees, and end up in a fist fight that ends up in manslaughter. That's way more likely to happen than for Jeffrey Dahmer to come knocking on your front door. So anger and crimes of passion, those are really the explanation and the reason for so much violence. Mm-hmm. So anything that's going to trigger that anger and rage is the thing that can lead to violence.
The point there is to diffuse, if possible, diffuse the situation. I think the police tactic is more likely to try to diffuse a heated sort of mindset or activity between the individual, the perpetrator, right?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. Every state now has a mandatory arrest law when it comes to domestic violence situations. If the police are directed to a home and they have probable cause because neighbors are saying that people are fighting, or they simply see something, they're driving by and they see through the window violence occurring and they have probable cause to enter, someone is going to be arrested. And the reason that they do that is to, as you just said, to diffuse the situation. To get these people separated, because when you leave them to their own devices, and again, oftentimes alcohol and or drugs are involved, oftentimes someone ends up seriously injured or dead. In the old days, the protocol was cops didn't like to get involved in domestic situations. They said that's personal, those are personal matters, we're going to stay out of it. But what the patterns that would emerge over the years are that eventually, if you don't step into those situations, somebody could end up, again, seriously injured or dead. That's why we have these mandatory arrest laws now.
Mm-hmm. So, Scott, it's been great having you with us. And just curious, so other than your blog on Psychology Today and your website, docbonn.com, as well as picking up your book on Amazon, Why We Love Serial Killers, The Curious Appeal of the World's Savage Murders, where else can we pick up information or see future stuff from you, maybe a new book or a program you might be associated with?
Well, I just, in fact, finished a documentary for Discovery that's going to be shown in August on Discovery Worldwide. And it's about the 40th anniversary, if you will, of the capture of the son of Sam, David Berkowitz. And we just finished production on that, and it's going to be a multiple night event on Discovery Network in August. So I'm pretty excited about that, and hopefully your listeners can tune in.
Terrific. We'll be looking forward to that. Well, I tell you, thank you, Scott. It's really been great having you with us.
My pleasure, and I wish you and your listeners a great day.
Terrific. Well, this is John, and I look forward to being with you on another episode of the Emotions Matter podcast.